Okay, here we are, week 5. Hard to believe, but here we are. Last week, you explored some characteristics of quantitative or positivist research models. And this week, you're going to focus on some experiences in which you'll explore characteristics of qualitative research or interpretivist models. And so I want to begin thinking about interpretivist models by asking you a question. And the question is, who would you say, like, imagine who would you consider to be a good teacher in your life? Like, just try to visualize that person or think about that person and then think about what were the characteristics that made that teacher good from your perspective. What were they? And the next question then is, if you could identify characteristics that made that teacher good for you, do you think that those characteristics would universally apply to what might be considered a good teacher in general? Are there universal characteristics that would define what makes a good teacher? And then if there are universal characteristics, what would you do to study that, to define those characteristics, and then to actually determine whether or not they were universal or somewhat universal? That is, they applied in many, many different types of educational settings. What would you do to study? How would you study what makes a teacher good? That's an interesting question, and what it kind of illustrates is that there are many different ways you might study it, and a number of those ways would likely be considered interpretivist or qualitative. For example, one way that you could study what makes a teacher good is by visiting classrooms, making observations on classrooms where somebody indicated that they thought this was a good teacher. So you might ask colleagues, friends, family members. You might go on social media and say, "Hey, I live in this area and I want to visit some good teachers. I want to observe them. So who should I go observe?" So somehow you'll recruit subjects, right? And they obviously won't be randomly selected because you're pursuing a lead, if you will. Although perhaps if you got hundreds, if not thousands of leads for somebody considered a good teacher, and then you randomly selected from that sampling frame or that pool, then I suppose you could identify, you could say, well, here's my sample, and that's somewhat random. But then you could go out and visit them, make notes, make observations, and try to study or analyze those observations to determine if what were the characteristics that you observed that made them good, and then see whether or not there are any patterns exist between different teachers who were identified as good. That would be one way to study it. You could also study it by just constructing a survey, I suppose, and just send it out to everybody who says they have had a good teacher in their life. Like, describe a good teacher to me in your life. Why were they good? And then people respond with these paragraphs of text, and then you could analyze all of that text. You could even use AI to help you analyze it, because there are many tools now for researchers to use that would make it easier to analyze large bodies of really open-ended data like that. So you could do that. But of course, once you identify what you think are characteristics that could be somewhat generalized to a broad population, then you might want to say, okay, well, are these I want to prove that these characteristics do in fact sort of result in a good teacher. And then putting ethics aside for a minute, I suppose you could do an experiment where you take two teachers, one who possesses these characteristics and one who flat out doesn't, and you could randomly assign students to one teacher or the other, and then see what happens. Your hypothesis would be that the teacher who possesses those characteristics that have been identified as making them good, that teacher would be more successful than the other teacher. But then you have to define success, and that's something that would have to be operationalized, because it could be, if you define success by how well students do on standardized tests, then who knows, maybe the characteristics for a good teacher are different in that case. Maybe the bad teachers, the ones who keep you in at recess and have you continue to drill, maybe they end up with students with better scores. So anyway, it's something interesting to consider, but a thought exercise like this definitely underscores the fact that different research approaches would be needed depending on what types of education-related questions you have and that you want answered. So this week you're going to be asked to review some of the notes for week 5 that all address qualitative research elements. I do want to point out that there was a learning objective from a previous week, or from this week, that applies to next week. I changed that in the objectives, but it won't make any difference for what you're going to be doing this week. I just wanted to point that out to you, that the objectives have shifted slightly. But you're going to review those. You're also going to read the last part of this book, and I'll explain why in just a second. And you're going to apply all of that to the 2 activities. So the one activity I'm going to have you do is to read through 2 different examples of studies that focused on the same general type of problem. One of those studies is a typical quantitative study, and then the other one, again, studying the same type of phenomena or problem, is very much a qualitative study. And I'm going to have you analyze the qualitative study based on information that's in the notes, sort of the characteristics that are in the notes for qualitative research. So that's going to be your reflection activity. And then your project for this week, you are going to actually sort of define a qualitative study that you might conduct in order to address what I think is a pretty interesting problem associated with something that is described in this book in the last part of the book, part 4. So in part 4 of this book, the authors they take the 5 kind of research-supported principles for learning and improving learning. And those are spacing, elaboration, concrete examples, visuals, and retrieval. So they take those that they've been addressing throughout the book, and they provide some tips that you might want to give students as a teacher in terms of tips for helping them learn based on those principles. There's tips for teachers in here. And finally, there's tips for parents. How might parents benefit from learning a little more about strategies that address those 5 areas, and what can they do at home to support their children as learners? And I really think it's really fabulous that they that the authors address parents, and that's actually what I'm going to have you think about. I'm going to have you consider how you might study study the effects of presenting parents with this kind of information on something that may or may not be happening at home. So it'll be quite a challenge, but I'm going to have you consider that and then define in your project what you might do as a qualitative researcher to study that. So that is, so those are the two activities for this week. I do want to spend just a minute though, or so, I wish it was just a minute. I do want to spend just a minute just sort of providing an overview of the notes from week 5 that address just kind of the big picture of qualitative research in general. So the first part of the notes address what is the purpose or the general characteristics that kind of define why you would use a qualitative approach. And some of the characteristics include the fact that you want to focus on the meaning of something or the perspective of something, usually in a naturalistic setting. And so it fits really perfectly with the idea of studying parents or the home life of students, because there's a lot about perspective and meaning and natural settings that would have a heavy influence on anything that you might sort of both study and draw conclusions from in that kind of an endeavor. The notes also present some information and examples about the role of the researcher in those two different approaches, because they're very different. In quantitative research, in general, the researchers attempt to have no influence or impact on the experiences that are being studied. They're observers out here. They may design things, but their influence on what goes on on the thing that they're studying is very much external. That is not always the case in qualitative research. In qualitative research, the researcher can become involved in the thing that is being studied. And in some cases, it is desired. The study you're going to read about for the reading reflection is a really good example of that, because you're going to find out that the researcher himself and his interactions with a particular subject really define the story that is being told. And that may not seem like research to you, but the more you learn about the qualitative approach and the scientific underpinnings of that, I think you'll see it differently in that regard. And the notes present some of the different models or methods of conducting qualitative research. They don't go into a lot of detail about the methodology. So when you are asked to define a qualitative procedure that you might do for your project, you're going to have to think more bigger picture and just consider what model would your activities sort of be informed by. And some of those models include doing narrative research or something called phenomenology. There's grounded theory, a case study, that might be a way to approach your studying, and there's also ethnography is included. And again, the notes don't include a lot of examples of these, so if you want to learn more about one type, I highly recommend using AI to ask you to explain to you in more detail some of those, because AI has really helped me out in this area, and even as it might apply to a research idea that you're going to have. By the way, if you do use AI, I'm just going to ask that you summarize how it was used in the development of your project, either as a background tool or something to help you sort of proceduralize your idea for a research study. And the last thing that I want to talk about with the notes is the fact that one thing that I'm sure is going to strike you when you learn more about qualitative research is the fact that there's a tremendous potential for bias. And you're probably going to see that in the research study that you're going to be analyzing in the reflection. And so I'm going to ask you to reflect on bias and then look at what the notes say about bias and look at what the notes say about minimizing bias and what you can do as a researcher to minimize bias as you're trying to sort of discover or uncover truths that you're trying to sort of focus on. Okay, so that's just the very broad overview. Again, you're going to read the last part of the text to help you with the project. You're also going to read through all the notes for for week 5 of the class, and you're going to apply those to the reflection and to the project. So again, as always, let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns about week 5.